In the quiet lobby of a London hotel, a frail young man held a newspaper mere inches from his face just to read the print. Watching him from afar, a mustached gentleman realized instantly that the authorities had condemned the wrong person, as someone nearly blind could never be the phantom killer striking in the pitch dark. What followed was a real-life investigation where the creator of Sherlock Holmes stepped out of fiction to solve a baffling crime and permanently alter the justice system. In 1903, the bleak, soot-stained mining village of Great Wyrley, nestled in the rural heart of Staffordshire, became the epicenter of a macabre and baffling mystery. It was a place defined by its coal pits and quiet, predictable routines, but under the cover of darkness, a phantom menace began to stalk the muddy fields. Local farmers awoke to horrific discoveries. Over a period of several agonizing months, horses, cows, and sheep were found dead or slowly bleeding out in the pastures, their bellies having been surgically slashed open in the dead of night. The sheer brutality and anatomical precision of these attacks shocked the community to its core, birthing a terrifying phenomenon that the national press would soon dub the Great Wyrley Outrages. A suffocating atmosphere of paranoia descended upon the farming community. Villagers bolted their doors at dusk, armed patrols wandered the pitch-black lanes, and wild rumors spread like wildfire across the county. The local Staffordshire police force was utterly baffled. Facing mounting public panic and intense, unforgiving scrutiny from the press, the authorities grew increasingly desperate. Leading this chaotic investigation was Chief Constable George Anson, a rigidly stubborn officer of the old guard who was determined to close the case and restore his department's reputation, regardless of where the actual evidence led. Amidst this climate of terror and institutional frustration, the authorities inexplicably turned their gaze away from the bloody pastures and toward a highly unlikely target. George Adalji was a 27-year-old solicitor of Parsi Indian descent. He was a remarkably quiet, studious, and entirely respectable young man who commuted daily to his successful law practice in nearby Birmingham. George lived at the local parish with his family. His father, Reverend Shapurji Adalji, was a notable historical figure in his own right, being the very first South Asian to be appointed as a vicar in the Church of England. However, in the predominantly white, insular, and highly stratified society of rural Edwardian England, the Adalji family stood out starkly. Their isolated status as people of colour made them a permanent anomaly in Great Wyrley, and to a suspicious and ignorant few, an object of deep-seated mistrust. This underlying racial prejudice had plagued the vicarage long before the first drops of animal blood were ever spilled in the fields. For over a decade, the Adalgis had been the victims of a relentless, vicious, and highly orchestrated campaign of anonymous hate mail. Threatening letters were routinely slipped under their door, cruel hoaxes were played upon the family, and mountains of unpaid goods were ordered to the vicarage under false names. The local hostility was an open secret, yet, instead of viewing the family as the tragic victims of a targeted harassment campaign, Chief Constable Anson viewed them with arrogant institutional contempt. Anson harbored a profound and thinly veiled racial bias, heavily rooted in the era's colonial mindset, and he deeply resented the presence of a foreign-born vicar in his jurisdiction. When the horrific animal killings commenced in 1903, Anson's prejudiced mind seamlessly connected the two entirely unrelated events. He convinced himself, operating completely free of any logical, forensic, or scientific foundation, that the quiet, legally trained son of the vicar was the malicious mastermind behind both the decade-long letter campaign and the nocturnal slaughter of the livestock. The investigation dangerously shifted from uncovering the truth to engineering a predetermined narrative. Officers stopped looking for a phantom in the fields and simply began watching the vicarage, waiting for the slightest misstep. Despite having absolutely no physical proof tying him to the scenes, the local police decided they had found their monster, and a devastating trap was set for the young solicitor. On a crisp morning in the late summer of 1903, the mounting paranoia in Great Wyrley culminated in a heavy-handed police raid. A squad of local officers descended upon the quiet, respectable vicarage of the Adalji family, pushing their way through the doors with the explicit intent of tearing the house apart. They ransacked the private quarters, desperately searching for anything that could connect the vicar's quiet son to the horrific animal mutilations that had terrorized the countryside. What they eventually confiscated was a collection of seemingly mundane items that the authorities triumphantly paraded as undeniable proof. They seized a set of old, rusted razors belonging to George, claiming that the dark spots on the metal were dried bloodstains from the slaughtered livestock. Alongside the razors, officers confiscated a damp coat and a pair of boots flecked with mud, insisting that these garments placed George at the gruesome crime scenes. To Chief Constable Anson, this flimsy collection of household items was the ultimate smoking gun. However, the sheer ignorance of the police investigation was staggering. In their desperate rush to pin the blame on the outsider, the authorities completely ignored an insurmountable piece of physical evidence regarding George's whereabouts. Every single night, George Adalji slept in the exact same bedroom as his father, the Reverend. Furthermore, the bedroom door was securely locked from the inside. Reverend Adalji, a deeply respected clergyman, swore under oath that his son had never left his bed, let alone the locked house, during the specific hours the nocturnal attacks took place. Yet, driven by an institutional tunnel vision, the police brazenly dismissed the sworn testimony of a vicar. The subsequent trial was nothing short of a judicial farce. In an era where modern forensic science was still in its infancy, the courtroom proceedings were severely compromised by the community's underlying racial bias. The prosecution spun a sensationalized narrative relying entirely on circumstantial evidence and the supposed bloodstains that had never been subjected to a single rigorous scientific test. The defense pointed out the sheer physical impossibilities of the police timeline, but the local jury, exhausted by fear and prejudice against the Parsi Indian family, remained completely unmoved. The crushing verdict was delivered without hesitation. George Adalji, a man with no history of violence, was found guilty of the Great Wyrley Outrages. The judge handed down a devastating sentence of 7 years of penal servitude. In the blink of an eye, the 27-year-old solicitor went from a respected legal professional to a condemned felon. George was stripped of his dignity and thrust into the grueling, brutal environment of the British penal system. He endured the harsh, mind-numbing conditions of prison life, performing hard labor while the legal career he had worked so hard to build was entirely obliterated. Then, in a bizarre twist of administrative maneuvering in 1906, after serving 3 arduous years, George was suddenly released. But this was no triumph. But the Home Office freed him, but they vehemently refused to grant him a formal pardon. He was thrown back into society with his name permanently stained, barred from practicing law, and forever branded as a monster. A ruined man with no future, George did the only thing he could think of. He wrote a desperate letter to the one man in England who made the impossible seem simple. When the desperate, pleading letter arrived at the home of Arthur Conan Doyle late in 1906, the renowned author was already an international literary superstar. Having famously killed off his iconic detective Sherlock Holmes a decade earlier, Doyle was attempting to distance himself from crime fiction. Yet, beneath the veneer of a celebrated novelist lay a man driven by a profound, almost obsessive sense of justice. As he meticulously reviewed the newspaper clippings and the fragmented police files George Edalji had enclosed, Doyle was immediately struck by the glaring inconsistencies. The narrative Chief Constable Anson had so aggressively constructed was not merely flawed. It was a labyrinth of logical fallacies that deeply offended Doyle's analytical mind. Compelled by the sheer injustice of the situation, Doyle agreed to take the case. He arranged a meeting with the disgraced solicitor at the opulent Grand Hotel at Charing Cross in London. However, when the appointed hour arrived, the author did not immediately walk up and introduce himself. Instead, channeling the very methods of the brilliant detective he had created, Doyle chose to hang back in the shadows of the busy lobby, observing his prospective client completely undetected. Sitting alone in the cavernous room was George Edalji. The young man was a frail, nervous shadow of his former self, visibly worn down by 3 grueling years of penal servitude and the crushing weight of public infamy. To pass the time, George picked up a daily newspaper from a nearby table. It was in this mundane, fleeting action that Arthur Conan Doyle silently unraveled the entirety of the prosecution's case. Doyle watched with intense fascination as George struggled to read the front page. The young man did not hold the paper at an arm's length, nor did he simply squint. He brought the broadsheet mere inches from his nose, tilting his head at a severe, awkward angle just to make out the boldest printed headlines. His eyes strained heavily behind his thick lenses, betraying a profound physical limitation. In that single, masterful moment of observation, Doyle diagnosed what the entirety of the Staffordshire police force had conveniently ignored. George Edalji suffered from extreme myopia and severe astigmatism. He was, for all practical intents and purposes, nearly blind. Stepping forward to finally shake the young man's hand, Doyle already knew the absolute truth. The logical breakdown was devastatingly simple. The Great Wyrley Outrages had occurred in the dead of night, in rural pastures completely devoid of street lamps or moonlight. The killer had to navigate miles of treacherous, mud-slicked fields, locate dark-coated animals in pitch-black conditions, avoid waking vigilant farmers and barking guard dogs, and then execute incredibly precise, surgical incisions on terrified, thrashing livestock. To suggest that a frail, virtually blind solicitor could perform such a phenomenally difficult physical feat without leaving a massive trail of chaos and evidence was beyond absurd. It was, quite simply, physically impossible. The police had painted George as a cunning, highly capable nocturnal phantom. Doyle's sharp eyes proved he was just a visually impaired young man who could barely navigate a well-lit hotel lobby without assistance. The author realized instantly that the local authorities had not made a simple investigative error. They had willfully blinded themselves to the most basic realities of the suspect's physical limitations, all to satisfy their own deep-seated racial prejudices and close a highly publicized case. Arthur Conan Doyle had seen enough. He promised George right then and there that he would dedicate his time, his vast resources, and his considerable public influence to completely clearing the Adalji name. He would step out of the realm of fiction and become the detective the British public believed him to be. But realizing the truth in a hotel lobby was one thing. Proving it against a stubborn, defensive, and prejudiced police force would require Sherlock Holmes' most rigorous forensic techniques. Leaving the polished corridors of London behind, Arthur Conan Doyle travelled directly into the bleak, coal-dusted heart of Great Wyrley. He did not arrive as a celebrity author seeking inspiration for his next novel, but rather as an independent investigator stepping seamlessly into the meticulous, analytical shoes of his own fictional creation. Doyle understood that to truly dismantle a wrongful conviction, he could not simply rely on logical deductions formulated in a comfortable hotel lobby. He needed to physically insert himself into the environment of the crimes, meticulously retracing every step and scrutinizing every piece of alleged evidence that the Staffordshire police had so triumphantly presented to the courts. His first target was the prosecution's supposed murder weapons. During the aggressive raid on the vicarage, authorities had seized a set of old razors belonging to George Adalji, pointing to dark, suspicious blemishes on the metal as definitive proof of the horrific livestock mutilations. The local constabulary had presented these stains to the jury as dried mammalian blood, a claim the court accepted with shocking credulity. Doyle, employing the rigorous scientific method that defined Sherlock Holmes, demanded a much closer examination. He quickly proved that the ominous stains were absolutely nothing more than common rust. Furthermore, the razors were antiquated and entirely dull. Doyle pointed out the sheer anatomical absurdity of the police's claim, noting that it would be physically impossible to use such blunted, delicate instruments to swiftly slice through the incredibly thick, tough hides of horses and cows. The police, driven by their desperate need for a culprit, had conveniently failed to subject the blades to any actual microscopic or chemical analysis. Next, Doyle turned his sharp attention to the damp coat and muddy boots that had supposedly placed George at the gruesome crime scenes. Chief Constable George Anson had relied heavily on this clothing, arguing that the mud definitively linked the young solicitor to the nocturnal slaughter. Doyle, however, understood the foundational principles of trace evidence decades before it became standard police procedure. He collected samples of the dirt scraped from George's boots and cross-referenced them with the specific geology of the fields where the animals had perished. The forensic breakdown was absolute. Doyle demonstrated that the soil composition on the footwear was entirely different from the agricultural mud of the pastures. The dirt on the boots was merely common road dust, consistent with a man taking a standard walk along the village lanes, not the heavy, distinct loam of the local farmlands. Another central pillar of the prosecution's case crumbled under the weight of basic scientific scrutiny. However, Doyle's most devastating takedown of the police narrative came from a simple, physical reconstruction of the timeline. The authorities claimed that George had slipped out of his locked bedroom, traversed the countryside, committed the vicious acts, and returned undetected, all within a highly constricted window of time. To test this, Doyle physically walked the alleged route under the exact same conditions. He paced the considerable distance between the vicarage and the scattered, isolated pastures. More importantly, he factored in the pitch-black, suffocating darkness of the rural Edwardian night, the uneven, treacherous terrain riddled with ditches and mining subsidence, and the extreme myopia he had previously diagnosed in George. Doyle logically demonstrated that for a nearly blind man to navigate this hazardous route without a lantern, silently subdue large, heavily muscled, and easily terrified livestock, perform precise surgical strikes, and flee back to a locked house without leaving a massive trail of blood and disturbance was a sheer physical impossibility. Through this exhaustive, methodical investigation, Doyle did more than just clear a man's name. He systematically dismantled the entire institutional framework of the local constabulary's case. He exposed the fact that Chief Constable Anson's narrative was not built on a foundation of physical evidence, but rather on a deep-seated, toxic racial prejudice. The Staffordshire police had not investigated a crime. They had simply weaponized their authority to frame an isolated, foreign-descended family they had long viewed with suspicion and disdain. Armed with undeniable scientific proof, Arthur Conan Doyle returned to London and prepared to drop a bombshell that would shake the British government to its core. On January 9, 1907, Arthur Conan Doyle unleashed the full, devastating weight of his literary prowess and investigative findings upon the British public. He did not release a new mystery novel. Instead, he published a massive, meticulously detailed exposé in the highly respected pages of the Daily Telegraph. Spanning an astonishing 18,000 words, the article was a ruthless, surgical dissection of the Staffordshire police force's incompetence. Doyle laid out every forensic failure for the entire nation to read. He detailed the rusted, blunt razors passed off as murder weapons. He explained the mismatched soil samples on the boots. Most importantly, he articulated the sheer physical impossibility of a nearly blind man navigating pitch-black fields to commit surgical atrocities. The creator of Sherlock Holmes had taken the methods of his fictional genius and applied them to cold, hard reality. The immediate public reaction was a volatile mixture of absolute shock, widespread fascination, and intense outrage. Readers across the country devoured the article over their morning tea, captivated by the surreal realization that a beloved fiction author had just flawlessly solved a real-life crime. The narrative of a brilliant, observant detective outsmarting a bumbling, biased local constabulary had leapt from the pages of popular magazines directly into the urgent headlines of the daily news. The public was thoroughly galvanized, transforming the forgotten plight of a quiet provincial solicitor into a national crusade overnight. People were horrified to learn that an innocent man had been thrown into a grueling penal system simply because of his racial background and the stubborn pride of a local police chief. The intellectual and legal communities swiftly rallied behind Doyle and his exoneration of George Edalji. Prominent authors, respected barristers, and influential politicians joined the fight, recognizing the terrifying implications of such a fragile and prejudiced justice system. If a respectable lawyer could be framed and imprisoned with such flimsy, fabricated evidence, no citizen was truly safe. Driven by Doyle's undeniable logic, thousands of outraged citizens signed massive petitions demanding immediate justice. The sheer volume of public support created an unprecedented wave of pressure, flooding the desks of government officials and demanding that the wrongful conviction be overturned immediately. The British government, specifically the notoriously rigid Home Office, found itself entirely cornered. Historically resistant to admitting any institutional fault, the bureaucratic establishment could no longer ignore the deafening roar of public opinion. Furthermore, they could not easily dismiss the irrefutable forensic evidence presented by one of the era's most famous and respected public figures. Conan Doyle had effectively trapped them in a corner built of logic and public outrage. Forced to respond to the immense mounting pressure, the Home Office reluctantly appointed a special, independent committee to formally review the Edalji case from top to bottom. The nation watched with bated breath as the committee sifted through the wreckage of Chief Constable Anson's biased investigation. When the investigative body finally delivered its findings in the spring, it was a monumental, albeit bittersweet, victory. The committee officially admitted that the local police had been profoundly wrong. They concluded that the evidence against George was entirely insufficient to support a conviction and completely exonerated him of the horrific animal mutilations. Consequently, the government granted George Edalji a full, formal pardon, effectively wiping away his criminal record and officially clearing his heavily stained name. However, the victory was marred by a final act of bureaucratic pettiness. Despite acknowledging their devastating mistake, the government stubbornly refused to offer George any financial compensation for the 3 grueling years he had spent performing hard labor in prison, nor did they compensate him for the complete ruin of his legal practice. The Home Office desperately clung to a final shred of institutional pride, attempting to save face by implying that George had somehow brought the trouble upon himself, an assertion Doyle fiercely and publicly contested. While George Edalji finally had his freedom and his legal career restored, this case's true legacy went far beyond saving one innocent man. The formal exoneration of George Edalji laid bare a terrifying reality at the heart of the legal establishment. Before this highly publicized ordeal, there was absolutely no judicial safety net for the wrongfully convicted. If a local jury, swayed by deep-seated prejudice and the presentation of entirely circumstantial fabrications, handed down a guilty verdict, that decision was effectively absolute. There was no higher appellate court designed to systematically review criminal convictions or challenge flawed forensic science. An innocent person's only hope for salvation rested entirely upon the arbitrary mercy of the Home Office, a rigid bureaucratic entity famously reluctant to admit its own catastrophic failures. For a marginalized individual like George, the system was inherently designed as a trap with no legal exit. Arthur Conan Doyle's fierce, unyielding crusade exposed this gaping structural vulnerability to an outraged public. His massive 18,000-word dissection of the Staffordshire Police's incompetence did far more than simply free a single Parsi Indian solicitor. It completely shattered the establishment's long-held illusion of judicial infallibility. The glaring investigative flaws of the 1903 Great Wyrley Outrages demonstrated to lawmakers and citizens alike that the entire criminal justice framework was fundamentally broken. It was operating without the necessary checks and balances required to protect innocent people from biased authorities, malicious local gossip, and junk science. Driven by the sheer intellectual and public outrage generated by the Edalji affair, Parliament found itself backed into a corner where it was forced to enact monumental legal reform. In August of 1907, as a direct consequence of Doyle's relentless advocacy and the undeniable proof of police malpractice, the government officially established the Court of Criminal Appeal. This historic legislative shift completely altered the landscape of British law. It finally provided a dedicated, formalized legal avenue for convicted individuals to formally challenge unjust rulings, question dubious evidence, and demand a secondary review of their trials. Thanks to the dramatic fallout of a rural animal mutilation case, no citizen would ever again be forced to rely on the miraculous intervention of a famous novelist to overturn a wrongful conviction. With his name finally cleared and his professional standing officially restored, George Adalji sought only to reclaim the quiet, respectable existence that had been so violently stolen from his family. Following the establishment of his innocence, the Law Society formally readmitted him, allowing him to return to his practice as a solicitor in London. Far removed from the muddy, blood-stained fields of Staffordshire and the glaring, unforgiving spotlight of the national press, George lived a highly private, unblemished life. He continued his legal work diligently and peacefully until his passing in 1953, carrying with him a lifelong, profound gratitude toward the mustached gentleman who had rescued him from a living nightmare. As for Arthur Conan Doyle, his unprecedented involvement in the case cemented a legacy that ultimately transcended literature. He is globally remembered for creating a brilliantly observant, hyper-logical detective who solved impossible crimes from the comfortable confines of 221B Baker Street. Yet, the grim saga of George Adalji reveals an even more remarkable truth about the author's own character. When a genuinely desperate man, crushed beneath the overwhelming weight of institutional racism and fabricated evidence, reached out in the dark, Conan Doyle did not merely write another captivating story. He stepped out of the safe, lucrative boundaries of fiction, applied the rigorous forensic logic of his own creation, and became the exact hero the real world so desperately needed. Even though George Adalji was ultimately vindicated, a dark and lingering mystery remained in the quiet, coal-dusted fields of Staffordshire. The Great Wyrley Outrages were never officially solved. The true phantom who stalked the muddy pastures and ruthlessly slaughtered the livestock in the dead of night simply vanished into the fog of history, never facing a judge, a jury, or the confines of a prison cell. This unresolved conclusion forces us to pause and consider a deeply unsettling reality about the fragility of truth. What if Arthur Conan Doyle had simply been too consumed by his celebrity or too busy writing his next novel? What if he hadn't cared to open a desperate, handwritten letter from a ruined stranger on that particular morning? Without the miraculous intervention of a world-famous author wielding the deductive powers of his own fictional creation, George Adalji would have almost certainly perished in a grueling penal labor camp. He would have been recorded by history not as a tragic victim of an incompetent constabulary, but as a deranged and violent monster. The entire harrowing ordeal serves as a permanent, haunting reminder of the terrifying danger that arises when blind prejudice successfully masks itself as impartial justice. As we look back on the extraordinary moment when the creator of Sherlock Holmes stepped out of the literary shadows to solve a real-life mystery and alter the course of national law, we have to wonder about the justice system as it stands now. If you want to hear more deep dives into historical mysteries where true crime meets legendary figures, please leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments. Do you think there are modern cases that desperately need a real-life Sherlock Holmes today?